Hello and welcome back. Get yourself settled in properly before we begin. Grab whatever you got nearby, a blanket, an extra pillow, whatever you need. Take a second. There's genuinely no rush tonight. If you've got a lamp on somewhere and you can turn it down a little, that's probably a good idea. If you're already lying down with your eyes half closed, then honestly, that's perfect. That's exactly where I'd like you to be. Tonight, we're talking about South Park, which I realize might sound like an odd thing to say at the start of a sleep video. South Park is not a show that most people would describe as calming. It is loud, it is deliberately offensive, it has been doing its absolute best to irritate and unsettle and occasionally deeply shock its audience since August 1997. There are episodes built almost entirely around the premise of making the viewer uncomfortable. One of them spent 11 minutes lovingly depicting an infected Splinter in graphic medical detail. Another one features a Christmas special narrated in a soft, gentle fairy tale voice that slowly reveals itself to be about satanic woodland creatures preparing a blood sacrifice. There's an episode that casually depicts a child being torn apart by a mountain lion. The show holds the distinction of being the first weekly television program ever to receive a TVMA rating, which should give you some sense of the tone. And yet, people fall asleep to it all the time. I've been watching South Park since I was probably a bit too young to be watching South Park, which I suspect is true for quite a lot of you as well. And there's something about it, some quality I've spent years trying to properly identify. That makes it genuinely good background television. Maybe it's the animation style, which is deliberately flat and simple in a way that doesn't demand much visual attention. Maybe it's the familiarity. Once you've seen enough of it, the rhythms and the voices and the general shape of how an episode goes become a kind of mental furniture. You know the music, you know the characters, you know that things are going to get worse before they get better and then probably funnier than either. Or maybe it's something else. Maybe it's that underneath all the noise and the chaos and the fart jokes, South Park is actually one of the most intelligent television shows made for adults in the last 30 years. And there's something genuinely soothing about intelligence, even when it's dressed up in extremely stupid clothing. The show's voice is also very consistent in a way that's hard to quantify but easy to feel. Parker writes almost everything, which means the show has a singular register that doesn't shift around the way shows with large writers' rooms do. You know how South Park sounds? It sounds like someone who's thought about something more carefully than they're letting on, delivering the insight in the form of a joke that might be a joke or might be a fairly serious point, and making no effort to distinguish between the two. That consistency, night after night, episode after episode, is part of what makes it useful as background sound. It's a known voice in a known place talking about something with a specific kind of irreverent seriousness that is, once you're calibrated to it, genuinely relaxing to be around. There's also the specific comedic rhythm of the show, which is different from almost anything else on television. South Park builds to punchlines slowly and then gets out quickly. It doesn't linger, it doesn't explain, it makes the joke and moves. That pace, once you're used to it, has a kind of efficiency that doesn't demand you stay awake to track it. You can drift and return and usually find yourself in a place that makes sense. So yes, people fall asleep to South Park. And the particular episodes we're spending the evening on are the ones where the things I've described above are working at their most concentrated, where the voice is most precisely itself, where the intelligence underneath the noise is closest to the surface, where the show is doing something that rewards being awake for it, but also doesn't punish you for drifting. Here's the thing about South Park that I find endlessly fascinating and that I don't think gets talked about enough. The show has been on the air for 28 seasons. It has produced 338 episodes. And the entire thing, every single episode, is made in 6 days. From blank page to finished, broadcast-ready television. 6 days. That's how long Trey Parker and Matt Stone have to write, record, animate, score, and edit a 22-minute episode. They start writing on Tuesday. Voice recording happens Wednesday. The animation and editing happens through the rest of the week, and the episode airs the following Wednesday. Sometimes the final cut is delivered to the network only a few hours before broadcast. That's not me being dramatic. That's literally the production pipeline. While most animated shows take anywhere from 12 to 18 months from script to screen, South Park does it in less than a week, every single time. It's one of the more remarkable things happening in television, honestly, and it barely gets mentioned because the show is so perpetually chaotic that nobody stops to appreciate the logistics. And the reason I'm telling you that is because of what it means for what we're talking about tonight. Out of 338 episodes made under that kind of pressure, there are a handful that aren't just good or funny or timely. There are a handful that are genuinely, quietly extraordinary. Episodes that do something unexpected with the format. Episodes that take the show's strange energy and focus it into something that actually holds together as a piece of craft. Episodes that years or decades later you can go back to and still find something in them you hadn't quite noticed before. Those are the ones we're going to spend the evening on. I want to be specific about what I mean when I say perfect, because I'm not talking about the most important episodes in the show's history or the ones that caused the most controversy, or even necessarily my personal favorites, though some of those will overlap. What I mean by perfect is something more specific than any of those things. I mean episodes where the premise and the execution in the emotional or comedic payoff all land in exactly the right place at exactly the same time. Episodes that work completely on their own terms. Episodes that you could show to someone who had never watched South Park before, with no context whatsoever, and they would still get something real out of it. South Park has a way of sneaking up on you with those. The show operates at such a consistent pitch of absurdity and noise that when something genuinely good happens, you almost don't notice it happening. You're laughing, and then you're thinking, and then at some point you realize that the thing you just watched was a lot more carefully constructed than it had any right to be. That gap between how cheap and stupid the show looks and how genuinely precise some of the writing is one of the things I find most interesting about it. So, tonight we're going to move through a selection of those episodes at a comfortable pace. There's no test at the end, no particular order you need to follow, no reason to stay awake for any specific part. If you drift off during one section and come back during another, that's completely fine. That's more or less the intended experience. Think of it as an evening of quiet company with someone who spent a lot of time thinking about a cartoon from Colorado and would quite like to talk about it. I want to say something about what happens to South Park as you get older, because it's relevant to how these episodes land. There's a version of South Park that you watch as a teenager, and it's mostly funny because it's outrageous and gets away with saying things that other shows don't. And that version is genuinely entertaining, and there's nothing wrong with it. But there's another version of South Park that you access later if you keep watching, which is the version that's been quietly doing something more interesting underneath the outrage the whole time. The show about fart jokes is also a show about how institutions fail people. The show about celebrity mockery is also a show about fame as a kind of madness. The show about a child who dies every week is also, it turns out, a show about a child who experiences genuine existential horror and nobody around him can perceive it. I don't think most people find that second layer immediately. It takes some time with the show. And the episodes we're going to talk about tonight are the ones where the second layer is closest to the surface, where you don't have to dig very hard to find the show being genuinely good at something rather than merely entertaining. Some of them are personal favorites. Some of them I find uncomfortable to watch even now, for reasons that have nothing to do with the content being offensive. A couple of them I've thought about for years, without quite being able to put into words why they stuck. South Park has also changed its relationship to its audience in ways that are easy to miss if you're not paying attention. The show has been making jokes about things that are now 30 years old. A child who was 10 when the show premiered is 40 now. The characters haven't aged, but the people watching them have outcasts, and the episodes that touched on something real about childhood or friendship or the specific melancholy of getting older have accumulated meaning in proportion to the distance viewers have put between themselves and those experiences. The episodes at their most personal tend to land harder the older you are when you encounter them. That's an unusual quality for a show that, on its surface, presents itself as barely caring about landing at all. All right, I've probably said enough by way of preamble. Get comfortable. We'll begin. We'll start with the darkest episode on the list. Not dark in a way that will upset you. Dark in the very specific way that only South Park can pull off, where something genuinely horrible is also undeniably one of the funniest things you've ever seen. It's a combination that takes real skill to execute, and this particular episode executes it more precisely than any other episode in the show's entire run. And then from there, we'll move through some others. Some funny, some strange, some surprisingly emotional, and one that made a lot of people genuinely worried that the show was ending. We'll take our time with each of them, there's no rush. Something I want to say about South Park before we get into the individual episodes is that the show is genuinely unusual in how little it explains itself. Trey Parker and Matt Stone have given interviews, done DVD commentaries, made a documentary about their production process called 6 Days to Air, and yet the show's creative decisions remain largely uninterrogated in the way that a lot of prestige television gets interrogated. Nobody writes long analytical pieces about South Park the way they write long analytical pieces about The Sopranos. Part of this is the reputation. It's a show about foul-mouthed children, and serious critical attention sometimes struggles to find its footing when the subject matter includes frequent jokes about bodily functions. But part of it is, I think, that the show's quality is weirdly easy to take for granted because the format normalizes it. You get a new episode every week during the season, it's always been there. The extraordinary production speed makes it feel like a utility service rather than a craft endeavor. But it is a craft endeavor, and the episodes we're talking about tonight are the clearest proof of that. Each of them required someone to have a specific idea, to recognize that the idea was worth pursuing, to construct a piece of television around it with precision, and to do all of that in less than a week. The speed doesn't excuse the occasional bad episode. The show has had those and plenty of them. But it makes the great ones genuinely remarkable. The show has also been made essentially by the same two people for nearly 30 years. Parker and Matt Stone met at the University of Colorado in the early 1990s, made the original South Park short films as college projects. The Spirit of Christmas films, which were early animated shorts that got passed around on VHS before the internet existed in its current form. And then pitched the show to Comedy Central, which took a chance on it in 1997. Since then, virtually every episode has been written by Parker, often with Stone's input, and Parker directs the vast majority of them. This is not standard for television, where shows typically have large writers' rooms and rotating directors. South Park is, in practice, a two-person creative endeavor that happens to employ a significant production team to execute the vision. Understanding that helps explain both the consistency of the show's voice across 3 decades and the specific way its best episodes work. They're not the product of a committee finding the right compromise position. They're the product of one person having a very clear idea and executing it without the kind of institutional dilution that affects most television. When Parker decides an episode needs to end with a Fleetwood Mac montage, the Fleetwood Mac montage happens. When he decides an episode should spend a substantial portion of its runtime in beautifully animated anime sequences, the anime sequences happen. There's a directness to the creative decisions in South Park's best episodes that is relatively unusual in television, and it shows. All right, I've been talking about the show in the abstract for a bit now, which is one of the hazards of genuinely finding it interesting. Let's get into the actual episodes. Get comfortable. We'll begin. This is the highest rated episode of South Park on IMDb, sitting at 9.6 out of 10. Which, if you've ever spent any time on IMDb, you'll know is a genuinely unusual score for a television episode, let alone one from a show that, in its 5th season, was still very much finding its feet with certain kinds of storytelling. The scores around it on that list are things like specific episodes of Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones from their respective peaks. Scott Tenerman Must Die sits comfortably among them, which is either a testament to the episode's quality or a fascinating reflection of South Park's fan base, or possibly both. The episode is named after its central character, which is somewhat unusual for South Park. Most episodes are named after plot events or concepts, the thing that happens, not the person it happens to. Naming this one after Scott Tenerman is telling because the episode is less about what Cartman does and more about who Cartman is. And by the end of it, as you have a very clear answer to that question that the show will spend the next several seasons building on. Here's the setup. Eric Cartman, who at this point in the series is established as selfish, manipulative, and casually cruel, but hasn't yet been revealed as the genuinely dark character he'll eventually become, buys pubic hair from a 9th grader named Scott Tenerman. He pays $16.12 for it. He believes, because he is 9 years old and not particularly well informed about puberty, that possessing this pubic hair will somehow accelerate his own development. He is wrong. Scott Tenerman keeps the money and laughs at him. This is the inciting incident. Cartman has been humiliated and financially defrauded by an older kid, and the rest of the episode is his attempt to get revenge. What makes the episode brilliant and what makes it work as a structural piece of television is the way it builds through 3 acts of increasingly elaborate but equally failed revenge schemes. Cartman's first attempt to get his money back is reasonable. He tries to argue for a refund. That doesn't work. His second attempt involves getting Kyle and Stan to help him understand why pubic hair doesn't work the way he thought, which just leads to more humiliation. His third attempt is to train a pony to bite off Scott Tenerman's genitals at the school carnival, which goes wrong in a way that results in Cartman being made to eat his own underwear in front of the entire school while Scott laughs. Each escalation ends with Cartman being further humiliated. And crucially, each escalation is funnier than the last, because the show is very carefully calibrated. You're watching someone try increasingly insane things to solve a problem that is fundamentally unsolvable by the methods they're using. It has the structure of a farce, a proper theatrical farce, with the escalation and the mounting desperation and the audience always one step ahead of the protagonist. What I find most interesting about the 3 failed attempts, beyond just the comedy, is the way they establish the precise dimensions of Cartman's competence and incompetence. He is creative, he is persistent, he is willing to attempt things that no sane person would attempt. But his plans keep failing because they're premised on the idea that direct force or direct manipulation is sufficient to solve the problem. He keeps trying to make Scott feel the same embarrassment Cartman felt. He doesn't understand yet that the right response to humiliation isn't equivalent humiliation. It's something worse and more permanent, and something Scott can't prepare for because he doesn't know it's coming. The pony scheme is worth dwelling on for a moment because it's where the episode does something quietly strange. Training a pony to bite off a specific person's genitals at a specific event is not a rational plan. It is not the kind of plan a person executes successfully, and the show knows this. It shows Cartman at the stable, working with the pony, patient and committed, with complete faith that this is going to work. The gap between his confidence and the obvious reality of the situation is a joke, but it also establishes something important about Cartman's psychology. He genuinely believes he can make the world conform to his desires through sufficient will. He hasn't yet learned that will alone isn't enough. Precision is what he's missing. The final act gives him the precision. That's what the reveal is, technically. Cartman finally understanding that the effective plan isn't the loudest one, it's the most complete one, and then executing it quietly without broadcasting it, which is entirely unlike every previous attempt. The episode ends with Cartman having learned something genuinely applicable, which is both the darkest version of a lesson and a structurally satisfying one. And then there's the final act. What I should say before I describe it is that the twist at the end of Scott Tenerman Must Die was genuinely shocking in 2001. South Park had done dark things before. There was an entire ongoing joke about a character dying every episode, but it had never quite done anything like this. The writers and the way this episode was crafted, specifically Parker and Stone working together on it, were operating in a register the show hadn't really touched before. The final act of the episode. Cartman, after all his failed attempts at direct revenge, announces that he is giving up. He invites Scott Tenerman to a chili cook-off. He presents a large pot of chili he has made. Scott Tenerman eats it. And then, while Scott is eating it, Cartman informs him that he has located Scott's parents lured them onto a farm, and had them killed by the farmer, and then retrieved the bodies and rendered them down into the chili that Scott is currently eating. Scott Tenerman breaks down completely. He's crying, he's horrified, he's eating his parents. And at this point, Radiohead, the actual band Radiohead, who Parker cold called with the premise and who agreed immediately, walks out from behind a curtain. They look at Scott crying. Scott, who is a huge Radiohead fan and desperately wanted to impress them, is now sobbing in front of them while eating a bowl of his own parents. And Tom York, absolutely deadpan, says, "I don't think we want to be around this crybaby." What gets me about this ending, and what I've thought about a lot over the years, is the precise emotional experience of watching it. Because you laugh, it is, in a very real sense, funny. The structure of the reveal is perfectly timed. The Radiohead cameo is executed brilliantly. And the detail that Scott's deepest wish was to meet his favorite band and that this is the context in which it happens. That's genuinely good comedy writing. But you're also aware, somewhere in the back of your mind, that you're laughing at something actually quite horrifying. A 9-year-old child murdered someone's parents and fed them to their son. Parker has said in various interviews that Scott Tenerman Must Die was the episode where he figured out who Cartman really was. Before this, Cartman was a bratty, selfish kid, annoying, frequently cruel, but fundamentally a cartoon character. After this episode, something had been established. Cartman was capable of genuine darkness, not cartoon darkness, but something closer to real darkness dressed in cartoon clothing. The Radiohead cameo, by the way, took something like 48 hours to arrange. Parker rang the band's management, explained the premise in brief, that their characters would appear at the end of an animated episode to watch a child discover he'd eaten his parents. And Radiohead apparently found this funny enough to say yes. They flew out, recorded their lines, and that was it. Given the show's production timeline, the speed with which that came together is remarkable. Cold calling a band, getting them to agree, flying them out, and capturing their performances, all inside the window of a single episode's production. There's something else worth noting about this episode, which is that it was originally written as a shorter piece. The Scott Tenerman setup was apparently meant to be one of 2 stories in the episode. The decision to expand it into a single full episode was made during the production week, and it was the right call. The episode's slow build, the patient way it lets Cartman fail repeatedly before the finale, is what makes the ending land. If you'd rushed through to the twist in half the time, it would have felt like a stunt. At full episode length, it feels like a story. At its core, what Scott Tenerman Must Die is about is the gap between what we expect revenge to look like and what it actually costs. Most revenge stories end with catharsis. The wronged party gets what they were owed, and we feel that the world has been set right. This one ends with a 9-year-old having crossed a line that can't be uncrossed, laughing and licking Scott Tenerman's tears while Radiohead watches, and the audience left to sort out exactly how they feel about having enjoyed it as much as they did. That's a more interesting place to leave someone than catharsis. And it's a better episode for it. I want to say something else about what Scott Tenerman Must Die does for the show's longer arc, because it's worth considering in the context of everything South Park became after 2001. Before this episode, Cartman was mean but comprehensible. He was a recognizable type. The cruel, selfish child who manipulates situations to his advantage, who doesn't care about other people's feelings, who performs victimhood when he doesn't get what he wants. Unpleasant, yes, but fundamentally a figure you understood and could place. After this episode, something had been unlocked. The show had shown that Cartman could plan something over an extended period with real forethought and patience. He had not acted on impulse. He had waited and watched and constructed a situation and executed it precisely. The darkness in him was not the darkness of someone losing control. It was the darkness of someone in complete control, pursuing an outcome methodically, feeling nothing regrettable about the outcome. That's a different thing entirely, and the show recognized it and started to build on it, Some of the show's most memorable moments in subsequent seasons involve Cartman operating in this mode. As a planner, as a strategist, as someone whose cruelty is architectural rather than impulsive. The episode about him infiltrating a NAMBLA convention, the episodes involving his relationship with Kyle, the later episode in which he leads his classmates in a Holocaust reenactment that he sincerely believes is justified. All of these come back in various ways to the character that Scott Tenerman Must Die established. Not a bad kid who sometimes goes too far. Something more unsettling than that. The episode also does something interesting with audience identification that I think about sometimes. You spend the entire episode watching Cartman fail, and during those failures, you're somewhat on his side. Not because he deserves the money back, but because watching someone be repeatedly humiliated creates an instinct toward their success that's hard to suppress. The episode exploits this instinct deliberately. By the time the final act arrives, the show has spent 30 minutes building your investment in Cartman's eventual revenge, and then it gives you that revenge in a form that implicates you in its darkness. You wanted him to win. He won. And you're not quite sure how to feel about the shape of the victory. That's not a common move in comedy. It's closer to what certain thrillers do. The slow build of investment in a protagonist followed by a reveal that the investment was in something you shouldn't have been rooting for. It requires careful construction and a willingness to leave the audience in an uncomfortable place. And South Park in 2001 was willing to go there. The episode's legacy in the show's fan community is significant. It consistently ranks as the series' best episode in polls across various platforms, and not just because of the shock value of the ending. The structure is genuinely admired. The way each failed revenge attempt is funnier than the last. The way the escalation is controlled rather than random. The way the Radiohead cameo is set up and executed with perfect comic timing. It's an episode that holds up completely when you know the ending. The craft that built to the twist is visible on rewatch, and it's impressive craft. There's also something the episode did for South Park's critical reputation that I don't think gets properly credited. In 2001, South Park was still primarily understood as a shock comedy cartoon. Funny, occasionally clever, but fundamentally a vehicle for transgression. Scott Tenerman Must Die forced a recalibration. Critics and viewers who had been willing to dismiss the show as mere provocation had to contend with an episode that was clearly doing something more structurally and psychologically sophisticated than provocation. The darkness wasn't accidental, it was earned, and that forced a different kind of engagement with what the show was actually capable of. Parker himself has said in interviews that the episode represents a kind of freedom he found with the character. The recognition that Cartman didn't have to be redeemed, didn't have to learn a lesson, didn't have to be punished for his actions within the episode's logic. The show could simply show you what this character was and leave that in the open air. That freedom, once found, changed the show significantly. Not every episode used it, and many of the ones that did use it used it badly. But the knowledge that Cartman could be genuinely dark, deployed at the right moment, raised the stakes of everything he appeared in afterward. There's a specific scene in the episode before the reveal where Cartman sits at the chili cook-off with Scott Tenerman eating his own bowl, watching Scott eat his. And Cartman is smiling, not in the performative way he usually smiles. Not the smile of someone trying to get something, the smile of someone who has already gotten it. The scene is only a few seconds long, but it lands differently than almost any other moment in the show because it's Cartman being himself entirely for probably the first time. No performance, no manipulation, just satisfaction. That's the most unsettling version of the character, and the show earned the right to show it here. The episode's legacy in the show's fan community is significant. It consistently ranks as the series' single best episode in fan polls across various platforms, and not just because of the shock value of the ending. The structure is genuinely admired. The way each failed revenge attempt is funnier than the last, the way the escalation is controlled rather than random, the way the Radiohead cameo is set up and executed with perfect comic timing. It's an episode that holds up completely when you know the ending. The craft that built to the twist is visible on rewatch, and it's impressive craft. There's a specific kind of episode that surprises people when they see it on a list like this, because it doesn't have the dark prestige of the episode we just talked about, or the cultural weight of the one after it. It's not an episode anyone would cite as South Park at its most daring or most controversial. It's just an episode about kids on bikes. Except it's also an episode about the corrupting power of adult material encountering childhood innocence. And it's a very committed Tolkien parody. And it manages to be all three of those things at the same time without any of them getting in the way of the others, which honestly is harder to do than it sounds. The setup is this. Stan's parents are having a movie night and need to send a copy of The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, to the Marsh's friends down the road. Stan's mother gives Stan the tape to deliver, except she accidentally gives him the wrong tape. The tape she hands Stan is not The Two Towers. It's a pornographic film called Backdoor Sluts 9, which has apparently been described within the episode as the single most depraved film ever made. Stan doesn't know this. He and his friends, taking on the full Tolkien framework with character assignments and epic quest gravity, set off to deliver the tape to Butters, who lives down the road. Butters watches it. From that point forward, the episode treats the tape exactly like The One Ring. The escalating desire, the corrupting influence, the way characters who encounter it start to change. When the boys try to take the tape back from Butters, he refuses to give it up. His eyes have gone strange. He keeps stroking it. He calls it his precious. The joke is obvious, but the execution is so committed and so precise that it transcends the obvious joke and becomes something more interesting. What I find most interesting about this episode is how well it understands the Tolkien source material it's drawing on. South Park has done parody badly before. There are episodes where the target exists only as a series of recognizable references strung together without comprehension of what made those references work. This isn't that. The ring allegory maps onto the pornographic tape so cleanly because the ring's dramatic function is to be an object that corrupts anyone who holds it too long, that makes people possessive, unwilling to relinquish it, gradually changed by proximity to it. Butters encountering this tape and not wanting to give it back and calling it precious isn't a shallow surface observation. It's structurally accurate. The quest framework the boys adopt isn't mocked either. The episode isn't laughing at them for treating a VHS errand as a genuine adventure. It's acknowledging that the quest framework is the correct framework for the gravity of what they're dealing with. The tape is dangerous. It needs to go back to the video store. They're the ones who have to take it there. The fact that it's also an inconvenient errand is the joke, but the quest feeling is real. Meanwhile, the parents are desperately trying to retrieve the tape without being able to explain what's actually on it. They can't tell the boys because telling them would be worse than the current situation. Randy Marsh is particularly good in this episode, as he usually is when the show requires a man who is visibly panicking while trying to maintain the appearance of calm authority. The scenes of Randy and Sharon coordinating their retrieval effort, talking in increasingly absurd euphemisms to avoid naming the tape's contents, capture something very real about how adults navigate subjects they've decided children cannot hear. Two entirely different registers of storytelling running simultaneously. The parents are in a farce. The boys are in an epic. And neither one diminishes the other. The Tolkien parody works because Parker and Stone know the material well enough to choose the right moments. The scene where the boys prepare to face the darkest part of their journey and Stan gives a little speech about how some of them might not make it through has the exact emotional shape of the Fellowship sequences in the film. The reluctant courage, the weight of what's ahead. It's technically a joke about kids trying to return a videotape. Emotionally, it plays like something real. Butters in this episode is the recipient of the quest rather than its subject. He watched the tape, was changed by it, and now is the thing the quest is trying to recover from. There's something revealing about him being the one this happened to. Butters is the most innocent and trusting character in the show, and exactly because of that, he's the most vulnerable. His openness, usually one of his most appealing qualities, left him unprotected. The episode doesn't make him a punchline for it. He ends the episode looking genuinely bereft in the way that characters in Tolkien look bereft when they finally surrender the ring, and the show treats his bereftness with the same straight face it treats everything else. I think this episode, more than almost any other, captures what it felt like to be a kid who was slightly on the outside of a group's adventure. Aware that something important was happening, partly involved, but not quite at the center of it. That experience has a very specific emotional texture that is not easy to replicate. Return of the Fellowship of the Ring to the Two Towers gets it right. The parking lot as Middle-earth, the video store as Mordor, the kids on bikes at dusk, riding somewhere that matters. If you ask someone to name a great South Park episode without much thought, this is probably the one they'll land on. It won the Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program in 2007. It appears near the top of every serious critical ranking of the show's best work, and it deserves all of that. But I want to spend less time on those credentials and more time on the reason the episode exists at all, which is a level of corporate generosity from a video game company that I still find slightly hard to believe. Here's the thing about Make Love, Not Warcraft. The reason it's so remarkable is not the concept, though the concept is clever, it's the technical achievement, and not technical in a dry filmmaking theory way. Technical in the sense that this episode required Blizzard Entertainment, the company that made World of Warcraft, to actually collaborate with South Park Studios in a way that had never been done before for a satirical television program. And the result is something that genuinely couldn't exist in any other form. Half of the episode is filmed inside the World of Warcraft game engine itself. Not footage of someone playing the game, not screenshots, actual in-game cinematics created specifically for the episode, using custom animations that Blizzard built for South Park's purposes. This required Blizzard to give the production team developer access to the game's internal tools, to create new character animations that didn't exist in the game, and to essentially participate in a long-form joke about their own product. The fact that they agreed to do this and that the result looks like what it looks like is still slightly astonishing to me. The story is this. The boys of South Park play World of Warcraft, as many people in 2006 were doing, and they encounter a player who is a high-level griefer, someone who spends all their time in the game killing other players at low levels, preventing anyone from enjoying themselves. The griefer is so powerful that even the game's developers can't stop him in-game. The boys' solution is to spend months grinding for experience points, leveling up until they're strong enough to defeat him. The episode then shows the months passing with regular cuts between their in-game characters, who become increasingly powerful, and their real-world selves, who become increasingly obese, pallid, and pimpled from sitting inside playing video games every day. They stop going to school, they eat while playing, they develop health problems, and their characters get stronger. The visual joke is very carefully constructed. The game sequences, which use Blizzard's actual graphics, look reasonably good. This is a 2006 television episode. The graphics are 2006 game graphics, but they have real production value. Cutting from those sequences back to the boys sitting in front of their computers, physically deteriorating in real time, creates a kind of beauty and decay juxtaposition that the episode exploits consistently. You're watching two parallel transformations, the characters growing powerful and the players growing ill, and the show never breaks from the logic of either. What the episode is really about, underneath the World of Warcraft specifics, is the texture of obsession. The particular pleasure of being completely consumed by something that doesn't, in any practical sense, matter. The boys aren't playing World of Warcraft to achieve anything in the real world. They're not even playing for fun, exactly. The grinding they're doing is arguably the least fun part of the game. They're playing because they've committed to a purpose, and the purpose has its own internal logic and its own internal rewards. and those rewards are completely disconnected from anything outside the game. That's an experience that a remarkable number of people in 2006 and subsequently have had. The show recognized it and depicted it without condescension. Parker and Stone have mentioned in interviews that they were playing World of Warcraft at the time of writing, which is probably self-evident from the specificity of the episode's satire. The griefer character, the person who has no apparent goal other than preventing others from enjoying themselves, was apparently based on actual players they'd encountered. The episode doesn't mock gamers broadly, it doesn't position the activity as inherently pathetic. It just depicts it with accuracy, which is sometimes funnier than mockery. The Sword of a Thousand Truths is worth a brief mention. It's a legendary item that exists within the episode's fiction, the weapon the boys are trying to obtain to defeat the griefer. And it's so perfectly named with exactly the right amount of epic grandiosity that it became immediately quotable. Blizzard later referenced it in actual game updates, which is a nice coda to the collaboration. The Emmy win was for the 2007 ceremony covering 2006 television. What's interesting about that is that South Park won the same Emmy 3 more times after this. For the Imaginationland film in 2008, for Margaritaville in 2009, and for Raising the Bar in 2013. The show has a specific relationship with the Emmy for Animated Program that reflects its recurring habit of producing work that, despite everything, is genuinely excellent television. The ending of Make Love, Not Warcraft, is the thing I keep coming back to. The boys defeat the griefer. There's a genuine triumph. The music swells, the quest is completed, the villain is vanquished. And then immediately someone asks, "Now what do we do?" And the answer is, go outside, and nobody really wants to do that, so they just stay inside and keep playing. That's the most honest thing about the episode. The victory doesn't release them from the thing they were doing. The obsession doesn't require a villain to sustain itself. When the griefer is gone, the game is still there, and they're still in it, and that's still fine by them. It's the most honest depiction of a particular kind of engagement with entertainment that I've seen in any medium. And it's also genuinely funny. The two things coexist without either one diminishing the other, which is what the best South Park episodes do. I want to go back to the Blizzard collaboration for a moment, because the more I think about it, the more remarkable it seems. World of Warcraft, at the time this episode aired in October 2006, was probably the most popular online game in the world, with somewhere between 6 and 7 million subscribers. It was a cultural phenomenon, and not a fringe cultural phenomenon. It had genuinely crossed over into mainstream awareness in a way that video games rarely did in 2006. Comedy Central, when approached about a South Park episode partly filmed in the game's engine, presumably understood the commercial appeal. But the thing that made the collaboration unusual was not the marketing logic, it was the technical generosity. Blizzard didn't just give permission to reference the game, they gave the production team tools to create content that wasn't supposed to exist in the game, including character animations specifically made for the episode. That's a different category of participation. The visual joke about the boys deteriorating in the real world while their characters strengthen is worth examining in a bit more detail, because the execution is more careful than it initially appears. The deterioration follows a specific medical progression. They gain weight, their skin changes, they develop health problems. But it's not the episode's primary joke, and the show doesn't linger on it the way a different kind of comedy might. It's observed with the same flat affect as everything else. The joke is not that gaming is bad for you. The joke is that gaming is extraordinarily, specifically absorbing, and that the boys have found something they're good at and are pursuing it with total commitment, and the externalities are simply the cost of that commitment. The episode doesn't moralize, it describes. Parker's comment in the 6 Days to Air documentary about the show's creative process is interesting to think about in relation to this episode. He talks about the specific pleasure of making something quickly, the way that production constraints prevent you from overthinking, from second-guessing, from filing the rough edges down until the thing loses its shape. Make Love, Not Warcraft has the quality of something made confidently by people who were currently doing the thing they were depicting. There's an intimacy to it that you wouldn't get from a more deliberate production, and that intimacy is part of why the episode still resonates with people who played WoW in 2006 and with people who've never played it and never will. Something I've always appreciated about this episode is how precisely it captures the specific culture around World of Warcraft at that particular moment. WoW wasn't just a popular game in 2006, it was, for a specific demographic, a kind of parallel life. A place you went that had different rules and different social structures and different status hierarchies than the physical world. The grinding culture the episode depicts, the way that time in the game felt more real and more purposeful than time outside it, was genuinely a thing that was happening to a lot of people simultaneously. The show caught it at exactly the right moment, early enough that it felt fresh, late enough that the culture was established enough to recognize itself. The griefer, as an antagonist, is also genuinely interesting as a character type. In most stories, the villain wants something. Power, money, revenge, ideological victory. The griefer in this episode wants nothing except to prevent others from enjoying themselves. His high-level character kills low-level players over and over for no discernible reason. He gains nothing from it. The only interpretation is that he finds satisfaction in the disruption itself. Parker has suggested this was based on real players, and if so, the accuracy is remarkable. The phenomenon of people who derive pleasure purely from the obstruction of others' pleasure is real and specific and entirely familiar to anyone who spent time in online games. That specificity is part of why the episode holds up so well. It was observing something real about human behavior that just happened to be visible in an unusual context. Good Times with Weapons is the episode that remembered briefly and completely that South Park is an animated show, and then used that fact in the most interesting way it possibly could. The premise is simple. The boys find a stall at a town fair selling real ninja weapon, shuriken, nunchucks, a kusarigama, and buy them without any adult noticing, because the show operates on the logic that adults in South Park consistently fail to apply basic supervision to their children. Armed with actual weapons, the boys spend the day playing ninja in the woods, imagining themselves as warriors from a Japanese anime. And then the show does something unexpected. When the boys are playing, when they've fully committed to the fiction of being warriors, the animation style changes completely. The episode cuts to fully realized anime sequences. Fluid, gorgeous, beautifully drawn, with dramatic speed lines and light effects and fight choreography that looks genuinely impressive. These sequences exist inside the boys' imagination, but they're animated with the same care and craft as an actual anime production, not as a parody, as the real thing. This is a remarkable creative choice. South Park's regular animation style is deliberately flat and simple. It's almost a conceptual statement that you can make a show this popular and this culturally significant while the characters look like they were cut out of construction paper. That flatness is part of the show's identity. It signals that the value is in the writing and the voice performances, not in the visual production. To then cut to richly animated, visually sophisticated sequences in the same episode is to briefly acknowledge what the show is capable of when it chooses to care about how it looks. The anime sequences aren't long. They appear periodically throughout the episode, whenever the boys are deep enough in their imaginary world that their inner experience is what the show wants to depict. The contrast with the regular flat animation is part of the joke, but it's also part of the genuine beauty of the episode. This idea that inside these 4 kids playing in the woods is something cinematic and vivid and lit differently to the world they actually live in. Butters inevitably becomes a casualty. He gets a shuriken through the eye during the boys' play, an accident. And the episode becomes partly about trying to keep this secret from the adults. They dress Butters as a dog so he can be brought to a dog show without anyone noticing his injury. The Butters with a shuriken in his eye plotline plays out in regular South Park animation, which provides the counterpoint to the anime sequences. Normal butters suffering in normal South Park. The ninja warriors magnificent in anime. The gap between what the game feels like from inside and what it looks like from outside. Let's Fighting Love is the song from this episode, and it deserves its own paragraph. It's the theme tune for the boys' imaginary anime, performed in the episode as though it's a real anime opening. The lyrics are mostly nonsense syllables designed to sound like Japanese without actually being Japanese. And it works. It sounds exactly right. It has exactly the energy and the melodic structure of a real anime theme from that era. It became, in the way that South Park songs occasionally do, genuinely viral before that was really a term people used. People still know it. Parker and Stone's affection for anime is genuine and surfaces a few times across the show's history. In major boobage, which we just talked about, and in various visual references scattered through the series. Good Times with Weapons is the fullest and most committed expression of that affection, and it works precisely because it doesn't maintain ironic distance from the thing it loves. The anime sequences aren't mocking anime. They're being anime sincerely inside a show that normally doesn't do that. The joke comes from the context, not from contempt for the form. There's something in the choice of anime specifically, rather than any other genre of epic visual language, that's worth thinking about. Parker and Stone grew up in the generation that first encountered anime as a genuine aesthetic force in Western media. Not just as Saturday morning imports, but as a distinctive visual and narrative tradition with its own logic and emotional register. The specific anime this episode draws on is the action anime of the 1990s, Ninja Scroll, Fist of the North Star, Rurouni Kenshin, which had a particular approach to physical conflict that was simultaneously stylized and visceral. The speed lines, the dramatic pauses, the moments where a character's power is communicated through stillness rather than movement. All of this is in the Good Times with Weapons sequences, and it's there because it belongs there. The episode is also doing something interesting with the question of what violence looks like from inside play versus from outside. The anime sequences show combat that is stylized and carries no real consequences within the boy's imaginary world. But Butters gets a real weapon through his real eye. The show holds both things simultaneously. The inner world of the game, which is epic and glorious, and the external world, which has real physics and real injuries and real consequences that have to be hidden from adults. The comedy comes from the gap between those two registers, but the episode doesn't resolve the gap in favor of either one. Play is real, so is the shuriken in Butter's eye. Both things are true. There's something I find interesting about where Let's Fighting Love ended up culturally. It became something that anime fans specifically adopted, sharing it as a joke they were in on rather than at their expense. That's a meaningful distinction. When something travels from a comedic context into the community it was nominally about and is embraced there, it usually means the comedy came from genuine understanding rather than condescension. Good Times with Weapons passed that test. If you're still awake at this point, and it's entirely fine if you're not, we'll move on to something rather different next, an episode that is, on the surface, a Christmas special. This is, without question, the most structurally subversive episode South Park has ever produced. And I want to be careful about how I describe it, because the subversion is the episode, and describing it too directly is a bit like explaining a magic trick. What I can say without ruining anything is that it's a Christmas special. It's narrated in a soft, warm, storybook voice, the kind of voice you might use to read a bedtime story to a child. The woodland critters of the title are a group of small, wide-eyed animals, a squirrel, a beaver, a raccoon, a porcupine, and others, who are charming and sweet and call Stan their hero and speak in the slightly formal way that storybook animals do. The music is gentle and Christmassy. There are sleigh bells. The snow falls softly. The episode's first act is, by the standards of South Park, almost peaceful. There's a warmth to the presentation that's unusual. The narrator is important, we'll come back to that, guides us through the critters' village with a fondness that feels genuine. Stan has been called upon to help them, and he helps them willingly, and the episode has the shape of a traditional holiday story about helping the less fortunate. And then the episode doesn't stay in that register. Here's the thing about Woodland Critter Christmas that makes it work so well beyond just the shock value of its reveals. It never breaks from the storybook voice. Not once. The narrator continues in that same warm, unhurried tone throughout the entire episode, including the parts that are not remotely appropriate for a bedtime story. The juxtaposition between the content and the delivery is the joke, but it's a sustained joke executed over an entire episode's worth of television. And the sustain is what makes it more than just a stunt. It becomes something almost surreal, like a dream where the rules of tone and register have become detached from the rules of content. What I think is genuinely interesting about this episode from a craft perspective is that it requires the audience to do active work. You're receiving information that doesn't match the container it's being delivered in, and your brain has to hold both things simultaneously. The gentle warmth of the presentation and the increasingly alarming nature of what's being presented. That cognitive dissonance is the experience of the episode. The narrator is Cartman. This is revealed about 2/3 of the way through, at which point everything you've watched has to be reevaluated. The story is his. The warmth and the storybook quality are his. The episode you've been watching was always a Cartman episode, which recontextualizes everything about it. His choice to adopt the fairy tale narrative mode, the things he emphasizes, the things he leaves out. It's one of the cleverest structural moves South Park has ever made. And it's not a showy move. It lands quietly, almost as a matter of fact. The woodland critters themselves are designed with genuine care. They're adorable. Their eyes are wide. Their expressions are earnest. Their movements are those of small, friendly animals being friendly. The character design is working against the content, and the show is fully aware of this. I've watched this episode several times across the years, and I still find the critters genuinely cute, which I think was an intentional creative decision. If they were designed to look threatening or wrong, the episode's tonal trick wouldn't work at all. They need to look exactly like the sweet woodland creatures the narrator says they are. The gap between their appearance and their reality is the entire engine of the piece. Woodland Critter Christmas is also technically a beautifully structured story. The fairy tale form has a logic and a shape, and the episode follows that shape faithfully. Setup, complication, climax, resolution, while putting entirely unexpected content into each narrative slot. There's something almost academic in how precisely it works through the structural requirements of a Christmas story while subverting each one. In another context, the same structure applied to a story about a child helping woodland animals prepare for an important event would be genuinely heartwarming. The episode knows this, and it exploits it. What gets me most about this episode is that it proves South Park can sustain a voice that is entirely unlike its usual voice for the full length of an episode without the voice slipping. The soft narrator is not a joke in itself. The show isn't winking at us about how weird it is that they're using this register. It just uses it completely and lets the content generate the dissonance. That kind of tonal discipline is rarer than it looks. The Christmas special format carries a specific set of emotional expectations that Woodland Critter Christmas is very deliberate about activating. Christmas specials, at their best, are supposed to make you feel something about the season, warmth, nostalgia, a particular kind of goodwill. The episode uses the aesthetic signals of this format: the snow, the soft music, the storybook narration, the cute animals, to activate those feelings in the first act. And then the episode's content creates a very specific kind of dissonance against those activated feelings. You're watching something that feels like it should be cozy and instead keeps revealing itself to be deeply strange, and the emotional whiplash is not unpleasant. It's more like the feeling of hearing a familiar melody played in an unfamiliar key. The reveal that Cartman is the narrator is one of the more satisfying structural moments in the show's history because it's retroactively inevitable. Once you know, you can't unknow it, and watching the episode again with that knowledge changes everything. The specific things the narrator emphasizes, the details he lingers on, the moments where the story takes a particular turn, all of it makes sense as Cartman's narrative. His voice in the narrator role is his storytelling instinct. He chose the fairy tale register not accidentally, but because it was the most effective way to tell the story he wanted to tell. There's something almost admirable about that, in a deeply wrong way. There's also something specifically interesting about how the episode handles the woodland critter's relationship with Stan. Stan is the hero of the story in the fairy tale sense. He's the boy from outside who comes to help, the good-hearted stranger who does what the critters need. But the critters' needs and the things they want Stan to do become increasingly strange as the episode progresses. Stan, at each turn, has to decide whether to continue helping. His discomfort becomes a kind of moral register for the audience. When even Stan finds something difficult to accept, that's a signal. The episode uses his reactions to calibrate how far it's gone, and it goes further each time his reactions suggest a limit has been reached. What gets me most about this episode is that it proves South Park can sustain a voice that is entirely unlike its usual voice for the full length of an episode without the voice slipping. The soft narrator is not a joke in itself. The show isn't winking at us about how weird it is that they're using this register. It just uses it completely and lets the content generate the dissonance. That kind of tonal discipline is rarer than it looks. I've also always been struck by the episode's pacing, which is genuinely different from the usual South Park rhythm. The show normally moves quickly, jokes land, and the episode moves on, topics change. The editing has an urgency. Woodland Critter Christmas moves slower. The narrator takes his time. There's something almost leisurely about how it unfolds, which is the fairy tale rhythm rather than the South Park rhythm, and the episode commits to that pacing throughout. It doesn't snap back to the show's usual pace during the disturbing sections. The disturbing sections have the same unhurried quality as the peaceful ones. That's the tonal control the episode exercises, and it's significant. It remains one of the most formally distinctive episodes South Park has ever produced, and one of the most rewatched. If you've seen it before and you're remembering it while I'm describing it, you're probably smiling in a slightly complicated way right now. That's the right response. Let me pause here for a moment. We're somewhere in the middle of the evening, roughly. The episodes we've been through so far, the dark revenge story, the childhood quest, the gaming epic, the anime interlude, the subverted Christmas special, are all, in their different ways, episodes that do something unexpected with the show's format. They take the basic machinery of a South Park episode and use it to go somewhere the machinery doesn't usually go. The ones coming up are a little different. They're more openly sincere. Best Friends Forever is sincerely about something. Margaritaville is sincerely angry about something in the measured way that the best satire is angry. You're Getting Old is sincerely sad about something. These episodes aren't hiding behind form or subversion in the same way. They're saying something directly if you look past the comedy. South Park doesn't do sincerity often. When it does, it tends to land very hard, partly because of the contrast with its usual register, and partly because the sincerity in these episodes is genuinely earned. Not performed, not forced, not calculated. It just arrives at the end of a lot of work and means something. There's a particular quality to the way South Park handles real emotion when it chooses to handle it at all. The show has spent 27 years building up enormous reserves of cynicism. It's essentially been practicing cynicism professionally at a very high level for a very long time. So when it turns and says something that isn't cynical, the contrast does a lot of work. The emotion lands harder because of everything that surrounds it. The Best Friends Forever speech about dignity isn't moving in isolation. It's moving because it's delivered by a show that would normally undercut exactly that kind of sentiment, and it doesn't undercut it, it lets it stand. That restraint is itself a statement. The same principle applies to Margaritaville in a different register. The episode is mostly a comedy about Randy behaving absurdly, but the Kyle crucifixion sequence, which is played with a specific kind of visual gravity, is the show choosing not to be funny for a moment. It's choosing to make its argument visually serious in a way that the jokes around it don't undercut. The restraint there is doing the same thing as the restraint in Best Friends Forever. It's the show deciding that this particular thing deserves to be seen clearly without distortion. You're Getting Old takes this further than either of them. It doesn't restrain itself from sincerity for a moment. It commits to it for the entire second half of the episode, and the comedy goes away and it doesn't come back. That's the biggest risk any of these episodes takes, and it's why that one tends to affect people most. If you're still with me, and even if you're not, which is fine, that's the point, we'll keep going. Best Friends Forever is the episode that won South Park its first Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program, and it's one of the episodes that I think demonstrates most clearly the show's occasionally extraordinary capacity for sincerity, which is a strange thing to say about South Park, but here we are. The context matters. The episode aired on March 30th, 2005, which was approximately 3 weeks into the national media obsession with the Terry Schiavo case, a real legal and medical situation in which the family of a brain-dead woman was fighting in courts and in Congress and on television about whether to remove her feeding tube. It had become a culture war flashpoint, with politicians and religious groups and cable news commentators all descending on the story with varying degrees of sincerity and self-interest. It was, in retrospect, one of the more undignified episodes of early 2000s American media culture. South Park made an episode about it, and it aired while the thing was still happening. The setup is Kenny-centered, which is notable because Kenny, as a character with almost no spoken dialogue and a defining trait of dying frequently, doesn't get a lot of extended attention. Here's the thing about Kenny that this episode establishes. He buys a PSP, one of the early Sony handheld consoles, and turns out to be extraordinarily good at it. Heaven, which is engaged in ongoing war with Satan's forces, has been searching for a player whose skill is sufficient to lead their celestial army in an angelic combat simulation that looks exactly like a handheld game. Kenny, it turns out, is the one. He's been recruited by God. Kenny dies, this is South Park, Kenny always dies, and is drafted into Heaven's army. He leads them brilliantly. The angelic war sequences are animated with genuine scale and drama. Kenny is, up there in the afterlife, actually heroic, capable and brave and taken seriously by everyone around him. It's one of the few extended looks at Kenny as a genuine character rather than a running gag. And it's used well. I want to say something about the heaven sequences specifically because they're easy to overlook in discussions of the episode. The celestial war is depicted as a handheld combat simulation. Imagine a strategy game, played in real time, where the fate of all existence hangs on the player's tactical decisions. Kenny is extraordinarily good at it. The show uses this to say something about Kenny as a character that it normally can't say, because normally Kenny barely speaks, is muffled by his parka, and exists mostly as a running gag about dying. Here in heaven, he's competent and capable and taken seriously by everyone around him. He's been noticed finally for something he's actually good at, by beings with the capacity to recognize excellence. There's a quiet dignity to that. The poor kid from the wrong side of town who barely features in most episodes, who dies without being mourned, is up in heaven being called humanity's greatest hope by angels. The show holds this without sentiment. It doesn't dwell on the irony, it doesn't ask you to feel sad about it, but the information is there and it lands. Meanwhile, back on Earth, Cartman discovers that Kenny has named him as his primary beneficiary for the PSP. And this is where the Schiavo satire comes in. Cartman becomes obsessed with keeping Kenny on life support. Not because he cares about Kenny, but because if Kenny is declared dead, the PSP goes to him. He manipulates public opinion. He organizes protesters outside the hospital. He gives media interviews. He invites politicians to weigh in. The episode is a near-perfect depiction of the Schiavo media circus, filtered through Cartman's explicit and well-signaled self-interest. And the satire bites because it's specific. It's not generically mocking the media or politicians. It's depicting a very particular dynamic where personal interest gets dressed up as moral conviction and deployed for maximum public sympathy. The protesters outside the hospital aren't wrong to believe life is sacred. They're just being used by someone whose interest in the situation is entirely financial. The episode doesn't make the protesters villains, it makes them people who are being manipulated, which is more accurate and more interesting. Here's where the episode does something that caught me off guard the first time I watched it. It's funny throughout. The Cartman material is very funny. Kenny being recruited by Heaven is very funny. The escalating media circus is very funny. But underneath all of that is an actual argument about dignity, about the fact that using someone's death or near death as a vehicle for your own agenda, whether that agenda is political or financial or just a desire to be on television, involves a specific kind of disrespect for the person at the center of it. The episode makes this argument clearly, and it doesn't undercut it. The moral is delivered by Kyle, which is appropriate. Kyle is usually the one who delivers South Park's moments of actual sincerity, and he does it here simply and directly without the show winking at itself. The speech isn't played for laughs. It's meant and it lands, and then the show moves on. The Terry Schiavo parallel, looking back at it from a distance of 20 years, holds up remarkably well. The specific dynamics the episode depicts, the exploitation of a private tragedy for public agenda, the way political and cultural interests organize themselves around a situation that was really just about a family and a medical decision, the media's treatment of a real human being as a symbol for whatever argument they wanted to make, are dynamics that have recurred many times in the years since. The episode identified a pattern, not just an instance. That's what the best topical satire does. One thing I always come back to about this episode is that Cartman's entire motivation is the PSP, and that keeps the episode honest. In a different kind of satirical treatment, the antagonist who wants to keep the person on life support might have some ideological motive, might believe something sincere even if wrong. By making Cartman's motive purely material, the episode simplifies the satire without dumbing it down. It says the sincerely held ideological position and the cynical material interest can look identical from the outside, and the performance of conviction in both cases is equally effective, which is a fairly precise observation about how media manipulation of tragedy actually works. The Emmy win was somewhat complicated by the fact that the other major nominated episode from the same season was Trapped in the Closet, the Scientology episode which Comedy Central pulled from rebroadcast under pressure. Many people assumed Trapped in the Closet would win, and its absence from the race may have contributed to Best Friends Forever taking it. Parker and Stone, who famously don't care about awards, weren't at the ceremony. But regardless of the institutional context, Best Friends Forever is a genuinely good episode. It does the thing that South Park does at its best, which is to use an absurd premise to arrive somewhere real without making the absurdity into a vehicle for preachiness. The argument about dignity and death is there, it's honest, and it doesn't overshadow the comedy. It coexists with it, which is harder to do than it looks. This is the episode that's a genuine love letter to a film most of its viewers had never seen, and I find something quite touching about that. Let me explain the reference first because it matters. In 1981, an animated anthology film called Heavy Metal was released. It was based on a long-running adult science fiction and fantasy magazine of the same name, which had started as a French publication and found an enormous American readership through the late 1970s and early 1980s with its combination of detailed illustration, science fiction storytelling, and considerable amounts of sex and violence. The magazine was, in a very specific cultural moment, genuinely transgressive. Full-color painted art that treated adult subject matter with the visual seriousness of fine art. The film attempted to bring that aesthetic to animation, using a technique called rotoscoping to create fluid, lifelike movement and painted backgrounds. The result was an R-rated animated film with a heavy rock soundtrack, elaborate fantasy and science fiction sequences, and a visual language that looked unlike anything else in animation at the time. Heavy Metal was not a great film in the traditional sense. The anthology structure was uneven, some of the segments were much stronger than others, and the connective tissue between them was fairly thin. But it was visually extraordinary, and it had a specific kind of cultural impact on people who encountered it at the right age. For a generation of animators and artists who grew up in the early 1980s, it represented a proof of concept. Animation could be adult, could be visceral, could be genuinely cinematic. Parker and Stone were of that generation. Their affection for heavy metal surfaces occasionally across South Park's run, and Major Boobage is the episode where they finally said it plainly. The specific aesthetic they're drawing on is the Tarna sequences from the film. A silent, white-haired warrior woman on a flying mount, rendered in long fluid movement with a color palette of oranges and deep purples, and the particular quality of light that suggests heat and distance. It's genuinely beautiful in the film, and it's rendered with real affection in this episode. What I find most interesting about the relationship between South Park and heavy metal specifically, beyond the obvious aesthetic debt, is what it says about the kind of media that formed Parker and Stone's creative imagination. Heavy Metal, as a magazine and then as a film, represented a particular argument that animation and illustrated narrative could be genuinely adult, could be genuinely sexual and violent, and philosophically serious, and that there was no reason this had to be considered lesser than prose or film. South Park makes a version of the same argument. The flat construction paper animation, the deliberately crude style, is a constant reminder that depth has nothing to do with visual sophistication. The show looks like it was made by children. The best episodes were made by people who had absorbed decades of adult animated storytelling, who understood what the form could do, and who used that understanding carefully. Major Boobage is where that lineage is drawn most explicitly. It's also just a very enjoyable episode. I've perhaps given the impression that the way to appreciate it is through a lot of serious analysis of animation history and the drug nuance question. And that's not quite right. Mostly it's a pleasure to watch because the heavy metal sequences are genuinely gorgeous, because Cartman caring for cats is one of the show's warmest running jokes, and because Kenny's expression of dazed wonder whenever the hallucinations start never stops being funny. The analysis is available if you want it. The pleasure is there regardless. The premise: Kenny discovers that huffing cat urine causes vivid hallucinations. The hallucinations look exactly like heavy metal. Full rotoscoped animation, painted backgrounds, heroic fantasy imagery. While Kenny is high, the episode switches to these sequences completely. Not brief inserts, but extended cinematically animated passages that look genuinely gorgeous. Then he comes down and we're back in flat South Park. This structure, the beautiful animated sequences alternating with the normal show, is the spine of the episode. And the beauty is the point. The show is not mocking the heavy metal aesthetic. It is using that aesthetic with full sincerity, the way you might imitate something you genuinely admire. The rotoscope sequences are well made. They have the visual quality they're reaching for. This is South Park in 2008, producing extended sequences of animation that look nothing like South Park because they wanted to honor something they loved. The subplot involves the rest of the town passing legislation against cat ownership to prevent the huffing epidemic. Cartman, in one of his rare, genuinely warm character moments, takes in the neighborhood's cats and hides them in his attic. He names them, he feeds them, he sings to them, he cries when he has to give them back. The contrast between the grandeur of Kenny's visions and Cartman quietly caring for a room full of cats is one of those South Park juxtapositions that shouldn't work and absolutely does. Here's a fun detail about the rotoscoping. The production team couldn't use the rotoscoping technique to its full extent given the compressed production schedule, so the animation was achieved partly through careful hand-drawn work designed to evoke the rotoscoped aesthetic rather than actually rotoscope live action. The effect is close enough that most viewers don't notice the difference. They approximated a technically demanding technique in a fraction of the time it would normally require, and they did it well enough that the result holds up. I want to say something about the emotional logic of the heavy metal sequences, because I think it's what makes the episode more interesting than it first appears. The sequences are beautiful. The show treats them as beautiful. They're not corrupting Kenny or making him worse. They're giving him access to something genuinely transcendent, even if the access method is deeply stupid. And the episode never really argues that the experience was wrong. The satire is aimed entirely at the town's response, at the meetings and the bands and the performance of concerned citizenship. Not at Kenny sitting on the floor of his living room accessing something that felt to him like being somewhere else in the universe. That's a quieter and more honest position than you might expect from a cartoon about a boy huffing cat urine. The show's genuine love for its source material, whether that's anime, heavy metal, Lord of the Rings, or world-building video games, is one of the things that separates its best episodes from the merely adequate ones. When Parker and Stone are satirizing something they actually love, there's a warmth and a specificity to the result that you can feel. When they're parodizing out of topical obligation, the distance shows. Major Boobage is a love letter. It reads like one. Cartman crying as he gives the cats back is the scene I always come back to. It's played straight. No undercut, no twist, no punchline that repositions it as a joke. He genuinely loved those cats, and he's genuinely sad to lose them. And the show just lets that be true. For a character who has cooked a child's parents into chili, this moment of uncomplicated tenderness is one of the more disarming things South Park has ever produced. South Park has used Cartman's capacity for genuine affection sparingly across its run, and that sparseness makes each instance more striking. Whatever makes Cartman who he is doesn't preclude some capacity for real feeling. It's just exercised selectively on his terms towards things he's decided matter to him. The cats mattered to him, and the show allows the feeling without irony. Sometimes that's enough. Randy Marsh is at his best when he's performing moral authority he doesn't have. That's been true of the character since his earliest appearances in the show, and it's the quality that makes Margaritaville his finest hour. It's also an episode about the 2008 financial crisis, and also possibly the most precisely observed satirical episode South Park has ever produced. But none of that would work without Randy's specific gift for wrapping naked self-interest in the language of righteousness. Context: the episode aired in March 2009. The 2008 financial crisis, triggered in significant part by the collapse of the mortgage-backed securities market, the failure of Lehman Brothers, and a cascade of interconnected financial failures across the global banking system, had happened about 4 months earlier. The recession it triggered was, by the first months of 2009, visibly affecting ordinary people in ways that were both severe and, in some cases, difficult to explain clearly. The financial instruments that had caused the crisis, credit default swaps, collateralized debt obligations, tranches of securitized mortgages, were barely understood by the people who'd sold them, let alone by the people who were now explaining to the public why their retirement savings had shrunk. And in the vacuum of clear explanation, something interesting had happened. The language of the financial crisis commentary had become almost liturgical. People were talking about the economy the way you talk about a supernatural force, something that had been offended by human behavior and was now punishing the transgressors. Spend more than you have, and the economy will smite you. Return to simplicity, to austerity, to the old ways, and perhaps the economy will be appeased. It wasn't quite rational, but it was emotionally coherent, and in the absence of rational explanations that anyone could understand, emotionally coherent got a lot of airtime. South Park noticed, and Margaritaville is the result. Randy Marsh is the episode's engine, which is where it needs to be. Because Randy is at his best when he's performing moral authority he doesn't have. His declaration that the economy has become angry, that people have spent too freely, lived too frivolously, offended the great forces of economic order. And his subsequent adoption of an austere lifestyle while wrapping himself in a bedsheet and preaching to the town has the exact shape of a religious revival. The bedsheet is not accidental. The imagery is deliberate. Gather round, Randy is saying, we have sinned and we must repent. Randy Marsh deserves a slightly longer look here because Margaritaville represents a peak of a character arc that had been building for several seasons. Randy started the series as a fairly conventional comedy dad, Stan's earnest, well-meaning, slightly hapless father. Over time, and particularly from around season 10 onwards, he evolved into something stranger and more interesting. A man with an extraordinary capacity for self-deception, who consistently reframes his own desires and failings as moral positions and social responsibilities. He's not a villain. He genuinely believes what he says in the moment, even when what he says is transparently self-serving. That's what makes him funny. The performance of conviction is completely sincere, even when the thing being performed is nonsense. Margaritaville catches him at his most fully realized. The fact that Randy's austerity is itself an act of performative self-righteousness. He bought the margarita machine, he's now giving it up, and he expects credit for this sacrifice, is exactly the hypocrisy the episode is targeting. He's not a sinner who has genuinely repented. He's a sinner who has repurposed his sinning into a claim to moral authority. The bedsheet is not a symbol of genuine renunciation, it's a costume, which, the episode suggests quietly, is probably also true of most austerity movements. Kyle, who is South Park's designated voice of reasonable argument in most of the episodes where he appears, takes the opposite position. The economy, Kyle argues, is fine. Spending money is how the economy works. The recession is real, but it is not a punishment, and it will not be fixed by austerity and self-flagellation. He tells people this. He goes from family to family and gives them money from his own savings to demonstrate that spending is not sin. He is, in the show's allegorical structure, the one preaching what the economy actually needs, rather than what makes people feel righteous. He gets crucified for this, literally in the episode, which is the most South Park way possible to handle that comparison. The subplot about how the financial instruments actually work is explained through a visual sequence involving a wheel of fortune at the Treasury, where economic decisions are made by spinning the wheel and letting chance decide. This is, in a technical sense, not accurate. But it captures something real about how the crisis was perceived. The sense that decisions with enormous consequences had been made by people who either didn't understand them or didn't care about the consequences, and that the wheel of fortune quality to the whole thing was not incidental. What makes Margaritaville genuinely excellent rather than just timely is the sharpness of the religious parallel. South Park had done religion as comedy before. The show has an entire back catalog of episodes making fun of various denominations. But this is different. This is not making fun of religion. This is observing that economic discourse in 2009 had taken on the structural features of religious discourse, and then following that observation to its logical conclusion. Randy wrapping himself in a bedsheet is funny, but it's also kind of accurate. The rhetoric of sin and punishment and atonement and appeasement was genuinely present in how the financial crisis was discussed, and the show just made it visible. Margaritaville won the Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program at the 2009 ceremony, making South Park's fourth win in that category in 3 years. It won in 2007 for Make Love Not Warcraft, in 2008 for the Imagination Land film, and now this. 3 genuinely different kinds of episodes, 3 genuinely different achievements, all made in the same 6 days per episode. The consistency of quality across those 3 very different episodes is the thing I find most impressive about the run. The Fleetwood Mac mentioned in Margaritaville is a brief but nice detail. Randy's margarita machine, the symbol of excess now sacrificed, marks the beginning of his spiritual journey. A margarita machine is such a specific kind of domestic excess, such a particular expression of disposable income, that it works perfectly as the thing that has to go. There's something almost affectionate in the specificity. The writers knew exactly which object would communicate late 2000s aspirational suburban spending most precisely, and they chose it without hesitation. The episode ends not with clear economic recovery, but with the sense that the ritual has run its course and things have improved, and nobody quite understands why, and the town doesn't particularly care to examine the reasons. The bedsheet gets put away, the margarita machines come back out. Nobody examines the Wheel of Fortune too closely. That's the ending this episode deserved, and the one it has. The Kyle and Jesus parallel runs deeper than a casual viewing suggests. Kyle's arc, going from place to place with his own savings, explaining that spending is not sin, that the economy needs circulation rather than abstinence, maps precisely onto the gospel structure. He is the one with the right message. He is rejected. He is literally arrested at one point. The crucifixion is visual rather than merely metaphorical. And ultimately, the economy does recover because people start spending again, which is exactly what Kyle was saying all along. But the town doesn't credit Kyle, they credit the austerity. The correct person was right, and the wrong people take the credit for the outcome. That's also a fairly precise description of how economic recovery gets interpreted in public discourse. What I admire about Margaritaville's satire is that it doesn't require you to have a particular economic position to appreciate it. It's pointing at the gap between what economic discourse sounds like and what it's actually doing, using the language of moral authority to describe phenomena that are fundamentally mechanical. Randy's bedsheet is funny not because economic austerity is wrong, but because it's not a faith position, and treating it like one is a category error with significant consequences. There's a detail in the episode that I've always found particularly good, which is that the South Park version of the financial system literally uses a wheel of chance to make its major decisions. Treasury officials spin the wheel. Whatever it lands on becomes policy. This is obviously not how the Federal Reserve works, but the joke is specifically about the gap between the complexity and opacity of financial decision-making and the public's ability to understand it. The Wheel of Chance is not less accurate in terms of public comprehension than a genuine explanation of monetary policy would be. The absurdism is an honesty about incomprehension, which again is the more interesting move. Right. Let's talk about the time South Park decided to make an actual epic. The Imagination Land trilogy, 3 connected episodes that were later re-edited into a feature-length film called Imagination Land, the movie for the DVD release, and which won the Emmy for Outstanding Animated Program in the 1 hour plus category in 2008, is South Park's most ambitious structural undertaking. And I want to be specific about what I mean by that, because South Park has done multi-part episodes before and after this. The distinction with Imagination Land is that it's not just a long episode split into thirds. It's a genuine attempt at sustained epic storytelling, with rising stakes and emotional payoffs, and a climax that actually builds to something, and a central character arc that is, and I want to be clear about how unusual this is, genuinely moving. The setup is this. Kyle makes a bet with Cartman about whether leprechauns are real and loses. The specific forfeit Cartman has demanded. And I'll leave the details vague because this is genuinely one of the show's extended jokes and not relevant to the main storyline. Becomes a subplot that runs through all 3 episodes in parallel, completely disconnected from the main plot, and is somehow both extremely juvenile and absolutely the right structural choice. It provides breathing room from the epic main narrative. It reminds you that you're watching South Park. It means that even as the trilogy builds toward its climax, there's a subplot, about an argument over a bet that refuses to be dignified. The main plot. Butters is taken by a terrorist attack on Imagination Land, which is the place where all fictional characters exist. It's a vast and carefully constructed world, populated by every creature from human imagination, Santa Claus, Mickey Mouse, Gandalf, Strawberry Shortcake, the monsters from Where the Wild Things Are, Aslan, Jason Voorhees, Smurfette, and hundreds of others, all coexisting in a single shared space. The world was created and is maintained by an entity called the Mayor of Imagination Land. It is, as a world-building concept, genuinely interesting. The idea that all fictional characters exist in the same ontological space regardless of their source, that Gandalf and the woodland critter Christmas creatures are neighbors. The attack on Imagination Land has been carried out by terrorists who have let the evil fictional characters, the demons, the monsters, the villains of every story, loose into the main part of the world. And the battle that follows is between those characters and the heroic ones. Gandalf charges at the demons, Aslan rallies the forces of good. The animated sequences here, particularly the battle sequences, are not doing anything technically unusual by South Park standards, but they're staged with genuine scale and a real sense of consequence. Things that matter in Imagination Land are destroyed. Characters that people care about die. Butters is the emotional center of the trilogy. Butters is always the emotional center of any episode he appears in prominently, but Imagination Land takes that quality and places it under the most direct possible pressure. He's the human character stranded in the world of imagination, and the question of how he gets home and whether he can save what's there is the driving story question. Butters' specific relationship with Imagination Land is that he can actually see it. He has always been able to see it, which the trilogy suggests has something to do with his unusual openness and good faith. He's not a special child in any dramatic hero of destiny sense. He just never stopped believing in things, and that belief gives him a specific capacity. The climax gives Butters the only tool available to him, his imagination. He's been told he needs to save everything, and he's a child with no weapons and no special powers and no army behind him. So he does the only thing he can think of, and he does it without fanfare or elaborate mythology. It's direct and childlike and completely in character. And it works, and it's moving. The show has spent 3 episodes building up enough investment in Butters and in Imagination Land that this works as an emotional payoff. A giant, gentle-faced Butters, drawn in the show's flat style, walking through a fantasy battleground, protecting the characters of human imagination. It shouldn't be moving. Formally, it's just a large version of a character in a cartoon. But by the time you get there, the trilogy has built enough investment that it is moving. That's craft. The feeling is earned by work done quietly and patiently across 3 episodes. Here's the thing the trilogy is arguing, and I think it deserves to be said plainly. It's arguing that imagination matters, that fictional characters are real in the ways that count, that the stories and heroes and worlds we build have a kind of reality that's worth protecting, and that the most powerful force for protecting them is the same force that created them, belief in their existence. South Park is not making this subtly, but it's a real argument made with genuine conviction, and the fact that it's made inside 3 episodes of a show that also contains a parallel subplot about a juvenile bet is part of what makes it work. The show holds the epic and the ridiculous simultaneously, and somehow the epic isn't diminished by the company it keeps. The casting of Butters as the hero is not an accident. South Park has several characters who could theoretically carry an adventure narrative. Stan and Kyle are the traditional moral centers. Kenny has heroic qualities. Cartman has strategic intelligence. But this trilogy needed someone whose relationship with imagination was uncomplicated, someone who hadn't been made cynical by experience. Butters is the only character who meets those requirements. His essential quality is goodwill, and goodwill is what Imagination Land needed. the world building inside Imagination Land is also worth a moment's attention because it's more carefully considered than it might appear on first viewing. The question of which fictional characters are good and which are evil in the show's taxonomy is not arbitrary. The evil side includes monsters whose purpose in their source material is explicitly destructive. Jason Voorhees, Pinhead, the Woodland critters from the earlier Christmas episode. The good side includes characters defined by heroism or nurture, Aslan, Gandalf, Santa Claus, the Care Bears. The show has thought about what these characters mean within their respective fictions and used that meaning coherently. When Gandalf charges into battle, he's doing what Gandalf does. The episode earns the moment by respecting the source material enough to use it accurately. There's also something interesting about the choice to include the Woodland critters from Woodland Critter Christmas on the evil side of the Imagination Land battle. It's a callback to Season 8 that rewards attentive viewers. The critters, who we know from that episode to be satanic blood sacrifice practitioners, are here on the front lines of evil, exactly where they belong. That kind of continuity between episodes is relatively unusual for South Park, which normally treats each episode as self-contained. The Imagination Land trilogy was willing to do the work of remembering what the show had done before, which is part of what makes it feel like an epic rather than just 3 connected episodes. The battle sequences deserve a moment too. When Gandalf charges at the forces of evil in Imagination Land, the show is not mocking Lord of the Rings. It's using it earnestly, treating Gandalf as a real character with real stakes. When Aslan rallies the forces of good, it's not a parody. The show genuinely believes, within its own logic, that these characters matter and their battle matters. That's the same quality that made the boys' bike quest in Return of the Fellowship work. The refusal to treat the epic dimension as merely comedic. The Cartman subplot running parallel to all of this, the juvenile bet, the farce, the total refusal to be dignified, is actually doing structural work. The trilogy is arguing for the importance of imagination, and the show insists on holding a completely undignified parallel story at the same time, as a kind of honesty. We believe in imagination, South Park is saying. We also still have Cartman doing this. Both things are true, and neither cancels the other. The Imagination Land trilogy repays watching as a feature film. The re-edited DVD version flows particularly well as a single piece. If you've only seen the individual episodes, it's worth finding the film cut. This is the one. If you know South Park well enough to have an opinion about its history, you probably know which episode I'm about to describe from the section heading alone, and you probably have some feeling about it. You're Getting Old aired on June 8th, 2011 as the mid-season finale of Season 15. South Park had begun airing in 2 halves per season, a chunk in the spring, a hiatus, another chunk in the autumn, and the mid-season finale had become a significant structural moment for the show. The spring finale was the episode people would carry with them through the summer break. The episode that aired on June 8th made a lot of people think the show was about to end. Here's what happens. Stan Marsh turns 10 years old, his birthday party happens, and something shifts. When his friends put on music, Stan hears something different from what everyone else hears. The music sounds to him like diarrhea, not metaphorically, literally. The audio that plays from Stan's perspective is a wet, flatulent noise where everyone else hears melody. This is not a temporary glitch, it continues. Movies sound like diarrhea. Television sounds like diarrhea. Food that was once good now tastes when Stan describes it like diarrhea. He has developed, as a result of turning 10, a complete inability to enjoy things he previously enjoyed. His palate has shifted and he can't find his way back to where he was. The show plays this mostly as a joke in its early sections. Stan's diarrhea sound reaction to music is funny, and the growing confusion of the people around him is funny, and there's a whole subplot about him being diagnosed with a condition called being a cynical asshole, which is also funny, and then the episode doesn't stay funny. Stan's parents separate. This is handled with unusual directness for South Park, which normally treats its adult characters' serious situations as comedy fodder. Sharon and Randy's separation in this episode is depicted with something closer to emotional honesty. Sharon explains, clearly and without the show undercutting her, that she has been repeating the same cycles with Randy for a long time, that things change for a while and then return to the same place, and that she's tired of the cycle. Randy doesn't argue, he leaves. Stan moves into a new house with his mother. His friends come to visit him. They're concerned, they want to help, and there is nothing they can do. Stan still hears the diarrhea sounds. He still can't enjoy things. He is genuinely, unmistakably depressed. Not in a cartoon way, but in the way that depression actually works, which is not dramatic or loud, but flat and gray and persistent. The episode ends with a montage set to Fleetwood Mac's Landslide. The song is used completely sincerely. It's not a joke, the placement is not ironic. The show is not commenting on the sentimentality of the choice. We see Stan alone in his room in the new house. We see Randy in a separate apartment. We see things that used to matter existing in a state of quiet suspension. The montage ends, the episode ends without resolution. South Park almost never ends without resolution. The basic structural contract of a South Park episode is that by the final minutes, whatever situation has been established has been resolved. Sometimes meaningfully, sometimes absurdly, but resolved. Something changes, someone learns something. The world returns to its baseline. You're Getting Old breaks this contract completely and without apology. The Fleetwood Mac choice is worth thinking about. Landslide is a song about getting older, about time-changing things, about the difficulty of accepting that what you were is not what you are now. It was written by Stevie Nicks in 1975. She was in her late 20s facing a decision about whether to commit fully to the band or pursue something else, and the song came from that specific anxiety about direction and time. I think about that origin whenever I hear it in the episode. Parker chose a song written by someone staring down the same feeling he was apparently writing about. The moment when the path you're on becomes real and irreversible, and you're not entirely sure how you ended up there. That's not a coincidence. Here's what I think You're Getting Old is. I think it's Trey Parker writing about what it feels like to have made South Park for 15 years, and to have lost, somewhere in that time, the ability to find it effortless. The diarrhea sound, the way that things you once found genuinely enjoyable now sound like noise, is a real experience, saturation of a form. The moment when your critical sense outpaces your capacity for pleasure. Parker has described in interviews feeling like the show was becoming less enjoyable to make, that the cynicism the show practiced as a creative tool had begun to bleed into his experience of the work itself. Whether that's exactly what the episode is about is something I genuinely don't know. Is this confirmed? Not fully. Has it been denied? Also not fully. What I can say is that the episode works as a piece of television on its own terms, regardless of autobiography. The experience it describes, watching something you once loved begin to sound like noise, is real and widely shared. And the show depicts it with a specificity and an emotional honesty that is entirely unlike what you'd expect from its usual register. The landslide montage. That's what I keep coming back to. Just that. I want to say a bit more about what the episode does in its first act before the sadness sets in, because the first act is also very good and it's easy to forget in the shadow of the ending. Stan's reaction to music is initially a premise for a fairly conventional South Park satire of a contemporary musical genre. The new music that the episode targets is a stand-in for a type of ironic pop music that was genuinely dominant in 2011, and the jokes about it are sharp. The diarrhea sound replacement is funny in itself. Kyle and Stan arguing about whether the music is actually good involves the kind of specific aesthetic disagreement between friends that is both immediately recognizable and inherently comedic. And then the episode starts doing something different with the premise. Stan's condition becomes generalized. It's not just a particular kind of music, it's all music. It's films. It's food. The enthusiasm he used to feel about things has been replaced with a specific sensory perception. Everything that used to be pleasurable now registers as unpleasant. And the show begins to treat this not as a joke, but as an illness, with real effects on Stan's life and relationships. The conversation between Stan and his friends when they first notice something is wrong has a specific emotional register I don't think I've seen handled quite this way in animated television. Stan is not dramatic about his condition. He's quiet about it. He doesn't perform his suffering. He describes it matter-of-factly, with the particular flatness of someone who is not sure what they're feeling but knows it's different from what they felt before. And his friends don't know what to do, which is exactly right, because there isn't anything to do. The episode is accurate about the experience of watching someone you care about be unwell in a way that doesn't have a clear intervention. Stan's parents' separation brings in a different emotional register, but both registers, Stan's perceptual change and his parents' end, are handled with similar restraint. Neither is played for laughs, neither is resolved. Both are simply true in the episode's world, and the episode sits with both truths without asking you to feel a specific way about them. That refusal of direction is itself a statement. South Park normally tells you how to feel about the things in it. The comedy provides a frame. Taking that frame away for the final act of You're Getting Old creates a specific experience of exposure. The follow-up episode, Asperger's, begins a reset. Stan is fine. The separation has resolved somehow. The episode acknowledges that it's a reset. There's a moment where Stan almost relapses into the cynicism from the previous episode, and the show addresses this with a degree of self-awareness. But the reset happens. The sadness of You're Getting Old is contained episodically, and life in South Park continues, which is, in its own way, part of what the episode is about. You feel something, and then you continue. You don't always recover fully, but you continue. The diarrhea sounds fade, things become tolerable. It's not the same as being better, but it's something. I've watched You're Getting Old probably a dozen times at this point, and it still lands the same way every time. Some episodes are like that. They don't become familiar in a way that blunts them. The landslide montage keeps meaning what it means. Let me say something about what the episode actually does structurally, because I think it's the key to why it works as well as it does. Most South Park episodes are constructed as arguments. Here's a situation, here's the absurd version of it, here's what the absurd version reveals about the real version. The episode's job is to complete that circuit, to arrive at the insight and let the viewer feel the satisfaction of the logic closing. You're Getting Old refuses to complete the circuit. The insight, that cynicism is a kind of perceptual condition that can develop over time and that may not be reversible, is never explicitly stated. It's experienced instead. Stan doesn't articulate what's happening to him. He doesn't explain it or process it or receive wisdom about it. He just has it and lives with it, and the episode ends while he's still in it. That's a more honest way to depict the experience it's describing. Cynicism and jadedness don't come with explanations attached. They just appear one day, and you try to figure out where they came from, and mostly you can't, and life continues. The episode captures that without trying to diagnose it or resolve it, which would feel false. The choice to use Landslide in the final montage rather than something original is important too. South Park has written original songs for some of its most emotionally significant moments. The songs from Band Geeks and Chef Aid and the bigger, longer, and uncut film. Using a pre-existing song here signals something different. It's saying this feeling already has a name and a sound that predates this episode. Other people have felt this. Stevie Nicks felt it in 1975 and wrote about it, and here it is again, unchanged, in an animated episode about a cartoon child. That continuity is part of what makes the montage feel so heavy. The emotion being depicted isn't new or specific to Stan or to Parker or to anyone in particular. It's one of the oldest feelings there is. What would it mean if the episode hadn't been followed by a reset? If South Park had stayed in that register, Stan irreversibly changed, his parents not reconciling, the diarrhea sounds permanent? I think about this sometimes. The answer is probably that it couldn't have worked as a long-running show. The characters need to return to baseline. The reset is a structural necessity, not a failure of nerve. But the fact that the reset has to happen, that the sadness of your getting old has to be temporary within the fiction, even if it lingers permanently in memory, is itself part of the episode's subject. Things change, and then usually they change back. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough to continue. The diarrhea sounds fade. Things become tolerable again. It's not the same as being better, but it's something. We're nearly at the end now. One more episode and then we'll start winding down. Grounded Vindaloop is the episode that broke its own format, and then for good measure broke the format of television in general, and I mean that in a specific structural sense rather than a hyperbolic one. Season 18 was South Park's first fully serialized season. The entire run was connected by a through line, and individual episodes carried elements from earlier ones into later ones. Grounded Vindaloop is technically part of that continuity, but it works completely as a standalone piece. You don't need to know anything about the season arc to appreciate what the episode does. The setup is this. Cartman convinces Butters that he is inside a virtual reality simulation. This doesn't require particularly elaborate technology. Cartman just tells Butters that the VR headset he's wearing is showing him a simulation of reality, and that nothing around him is real, and Butters believes him completely, immediately, without significant resistance. Because Butters, who is fundamentally the most trusting character in the show's history, receives new information in good faith. This belief changes Butters' behavior significantly. If nothing is real, nothing has consequences. He swears at his father, which earns him a punishment. But Butters doesn't care about the punishment because the punishment isn't real. His father grounds him. But Butters doesn't care about being grounded because the room he's being grounded in isn't real. His father threatens to take away his phone. Butters doesn't care. Butters has, in a single piece of information, been completely liberated from the normal structure of his life. The comedy here is very precise. Butters isn't stupid. He's simply applied the information he's been given with complete logical consistency. If the world is a simulation, then the rules of the world are arbitrary constructs with no binding force. His father's authority, his privileges, his punishments, none of them exist in any meaningful sense. Butters has done the philosophy. He's arrived at the correct conclusion given his premises. The premises are wrong, but his reasoning is sound. What I find most interesting about Butters' behavior in this episode is how calm it is. He's not gleeful about his new freedom. He doesn't use it to do outrageous things or cause mayhem. He simply stops caring about the consequences of small transgressions because those consequences aren't real. There's almost something peaceful about it. He swears at his father with the same flat affect he uses when discussing anything else. He sits in his room when grounded without visible frustration. He has achieved a kind of equanimity that most people spend decades trying to find through meditation. And he found it by believing something Cartman told him. That's also quite a cutting observation about the power of belief systems generally, dressed up as a joke about a cartoon child. The scenario Cartman creates is the exact scenario that philosophers have been worried about since at least the 17th century. Descartes framed it as a malicious demon feeding you false sense impressions. The Matrix framed it as a computer simulation. Cartman frames it as a VR headset from Oculus. The epistemological problem is identical in all three versions. The only difference is who's running the deception and why. The episode then introduces a parallel storyline involving Cartman attempting to sort out the mess he's created by calling Oculus customer support. The call is routed through multiple levels of support, each of which claims the previous level isn't real. They're in their own simulation, they say. The regression is potentially infinite. Cartman spends the episode descending through levels of customer service hell, each one claiming reality belongs to a different tier. The joke is the infinite regress itself, the way that the question, "But are you real?" can always be asked of the next level without ever arriving at bedrock. The final act performs a nested reality twist that I don't want to describe in detail because it's the kind of thing that rewards watching rather than being summarized. What I can say is that it's executed with structural cleverness. The show uses its own logic against itself in a way that briefly makes you uncertain about what you've been watching. And it lands cleanly without the loose threads this kind of move often leaves behind. What makes Grounded Vindaloop unusual in the context of this list is that it's not an emotional episode. It's not trying to make you feel something in the way that You're Getting Old is, or Best Friends Forever. It's a puzzle box, a comedy episode constructed as a logical problem with a beginning and a middle and an end that connect, and where the fun is in following the logic rather than in any emotional payoff. South Park doesn't do this often. The show's usual mode is free associative. Ideas connect through cultural proximity and comic energy rather than careful logical construction. Grounded Vindaloop is the exception, and it's worth appreciating as such. Season 18, which introduced the fully serialized format for the first time, was a creative experiment that yielded mixed results across the full run of episodes. Grounded Vindaloop functions as a closed loop, a puzzle box that opens and closes completely in a single episode. That's a different achievement from what the serialized season was attempting, and I think it's one of the reasons the episode has lasted so well. The final image, Butters in his room. Grounded, staring at the wall, entirely peaceful. He knows the wall isn't real. He knows the room isn't real. He knows the grounding isn't real. And from inside his belief system, he's free in a way that his father's punishment cannot touch. The show gives him this without taking it away. The episode ends, and Butters is still grounded, and Butters still doesn't care. He's found the gap in the system, and he's sitting in it, and he looks okay. I find that oddly comforting. Good night, Butters. All right, I think we've been at this for a while now. I find myself wanting to say one more thing before we properly wind down, which is that all of these episodes, every single one of them, was made in 6 days. Scott Tenerman must die. The Imagination Land trilogy, You're Getting Old and the Fleetwood Mac montage, Margaritaville and its precise economic satire, 6 days each, from blank page to broadcast. That gap between the conditions of production and the quality of what was produced is one of the more remarkable things in television history, and it barely gets mentioned because the show is too busy being loud and chaotic for anyone to stop and notice. I find that genuinely worth sitting with. Here's the other thing I keep coming back to. All of these episodes, across all the different things they do and all the different places they arrive, have something in common. They all, at some point, take their own premise seriously. Not every episode of South Park does this. Some of them are purely mechanical. Here is a cultural target, here's a joke, here's the next one. But the best episodes, the ones on this list, commit to whatever the episode needs them to believe in. The Imagination Land trilogy believes in imagination. You're Getting Old believes in the reality of the feeling it's depicting. Make Love, not Warcraft, believes in the texture of the experience it's describing. Even Scott Tenerman Must Die believes in the logic of its own dark ending. That's what makes them perfect, I think. Not the awards, not the IMDb scores, the belief. I should probably stop here, but I won't quite yet. There's one more thing I want to say about South Park's relationship to the culture around it, which is that the show has always operated from a position of genuine independence that is rare for something this commercially significant. Parker and Stone have, across the show's history, refused a remarkable number of things that television shows of this size normally accept. Notes on particular targets, pressure from advertisers, the kind of institutional self-censorship that tends to smooth the edges off popular satire over time. Not always successfully and not perfectly. The Comedy Central censorship of the Muhammad episodes is the obvious counterexample. But the general orientation of the show has been toward doing the thing they thought was right rather than the thing that would cause the least friction. That independence is visible in the episodes we've talked about tonight. The willingness to end You're Getting Old without resolution, to let the sadness sit without redemption, is a creative decision that a different show, one more concerned with what the audience expected, might not have made. The willingness to give Scott Tenerman Must Die its dark ending, to not pull back at the last moment, is the same kind of decision. These episodes go where they need to go because Parker and Stone were in a position and chose to use that position to let them. All right, now I'm really getting close to done. Let me say something about time because I've been thinking about it throughout the evening. South Park is one of the few shows in television history that is old enough to have a relationship with its own past. The boys have been in 4th grade since 1997. If you're in your late 30s or early 40s, you have been watching these characters for more than half your life. That's an unusual circumstance for a piece of entertainment to put anyone in. The show hasn't aged because the show is by design not allowed to age. The characters are frozen, the town is frozen, the bus stop is always the same, but the people watching have been aging the whole time, and there's a specific quality to watching something you've watched since childhood, which is that your perspective on it keeps changing even as the thing itself doesn't. I watched You're Getting Old when I was a different age than I would watch it now. I watched Scott Tenerman Must Die when I was a different age than I would watch it now. The episodes are unchanged. What I bring to them has accumulated. That accumulation is, in its own small way, part of what the episodes are about. Not because the writers planned it that way, they couldn't have, not specifically onkakin, but because art that's genuinely about universal experiences tends to grow into them over time. The episodes we've talked about tonight are about aging, about obsession, about the cost of revenge, about the persistence of imagination, about the specific sadness of a Sunday afternoon when things that used to sound good start sounding like noise. All of those things remain true across decades. The episodes keep collecting more of them. Actually, one more thing. I want to say something about what it's like to watch this show across a long stretch of your own life, because I don't think that gets talked about enough. South Park has been running long enough now that people have genuine biographical relationships with it. They started watching as children or teenagers or in their 20s, and the show has aged alongside them. The episodes that meant something at 13 don't mean the same thing at 30. Some episodes that seem merely funny in their original airing turn out, with more life experience, to have been about something you didn't have the vocabulary for yet. You're Getting Old is like that for a lot of people. You can watch it at 16, and it's a funny episode about a kid who thinks music sounds like farts. You can watch it at 35 and find yourself unexpectedly sitting very still at the end of it. That capacity, for the same piece of television to mean different things at different distances, is something the best episodes have. It's not unique to South Park, but South Park has it, and the episodes on this list have it most. There's one more dimension to this worth naming, which is the show's specific relationship with internet culture and the way episodes from the early 2000s became a kind of shared language for a generation that grew up online. The memes from the classic seasons, the mocking SpongeBob pose that's actually from an episode we didn't discuss tonight, Sweet Victory from Band Geeks, the chocolate woman, I'm sorry, I thought this was America. These became genuine cultural currency in the way that television almost never manages. The episodes were quotable in a very specific sense, not just funny lines, but compressed emotional reactions that people recognize from their own experience. That's rarer than it looks. Most comedy is funny in the moment and gone. South Park, at its best, produced jokes that encoded specific human situations so precisely that they became reusable. The IMDb score for Scott Tenerman Must Die isn't just nostalgia. It's a reflection of how many people found in that episode something that needed to exist and didn't exist before, which is, I think, the final thing I want to say about why these episodes in particular. They all made something that needed to exist. They filled a gap in what was possible. and that's as good a definition of perfect as I have. Let me tell you about the bus stop. The show opens with the boys at the bus stop in most of its episodes. 4 small figures standing in the snow outside their houses, waiting for the school bus, talking about whatever they're talking about. It's been consistent across 28 seasons. The figures have been the same, slightly redesigned here and there, standing in the same spot. Stan with his red and blue hat, Kyle with the green Ushanka, Cartman in his red jacket, Kenny in the orange parka with the hood pulled tight so you can't quite see his face. They've been there since 1997. They'll probably be there long after most of us have stopped paying attention. And every episode begins with some version of that image. The boys at the bus stop, waiting, talking, doing the thing that kids do when they're between places. Killing time, being together, arguing about something that doesn't matter. I've been watching that image for a long time, and it still makes me feel something I can't quite name. Something about the persistence of it. The boys are always the same age. The snow is always falling the same way. Somewhere in Culver City, California, 2 people are probably in the middle of an episode right now, working on the thing that will air in a few days. And however strange or chaotic or upsetting or funny it turns out to be, it will start with those 4 kids at that bus stop. That's not nothing. After all this time, that continuity is actually quite something. I keep thinking about the episodes we've gone through tonight and the characters at their centers and how each one ends in a sort of equilibrium that isn't resolution, but is nonetheless okay. Cartman licking his tears while Radiohead watches impassively. The boys on their bikes having finally delivered the tape, the quest completed, heading home. Boys with their controllers, the griefer defeated, still not going outside. Kenny in heaven, capable and serious, leading an army that will forget him by morning. Cartman in his attic, quietly feeding the cats he's not supposed to have. Randy folding the bedsheet, the austerity period quietly over. Giant Butters, gentle-faced, walking through imagination land. Stan alone in his new room, a quiet he can't name. Butters in his grounded room, entirely peaceful, staring at a wall he knows isn't real. All of them at their respective bus stops, waiting for whatever comes next. The show has been running for long enough that the characters have become a kind of company. Familiar presences that exist in a particular corner of consciousness for people who've spent time with them. Not friends exactly, but something in that neighborhood. The specific comfort of returning to a world with known rules and known people, even when those rules are flexible and those people are occasionally monstrous. One last thing, and then I'll genuinely let you go. The last episode we talked about was grounded vindaloop, and the last image from Awash was Butters in his room, completely at peace because he believes he's in a simulation. And there's something I find myself thinking about in relation to that image and this one, the boys at the bus stop. Both images are about characters who have found a way to be okay inside situations that don't, from the outside, look entirely okay. Butters is grounded. Kenny is going to die again. Stan might still hear the sound sometimes. The town is probably gearing up for something chaotic. But there they are, waiting, together. Okay, South Park will still be there in the morning. It'll still be making episodes. Kenny will still be alive for now, probably. And if you happen to dream about a small, cold mountain town where the physics are flexible and the satire is sharp and nothing quite makes sense, but everything somehow coheres, well, that's a reasonable place to spend an evening. Sleep well. Good night. See you next time.